And welcome to Football Island and another edition of Gridiron Nation on TSN. A somewhat different show today, a little bit bigger. We'll recap it, Canadians in the NCAA, of course, but we will do a deep dive into the CFL rule changes and how it will affect football at all levels of the sport. John Hodge will join us later in the show for that. As always, joined by Gord Randall and Gord stateside. Antoine Raymond, Daryl Jabome, Jet Elad, all outstanding Canadian players on a Rutgers team that is less than outstanding in their conference at 0-2. What does it say?
I think it says how difficult it is to win at Rutgers. Gridiron's done a fantastic job there just to get them into the mix in the Big Ten. But I think what we're seeing as this new Big Ten with the West Coast additions is shaking out is that there is a very clear top tier in the Big Ten, and it is very difficult to climb out of the mass of the Big Ten up into that top tier unless you have some very big structural advantages. So a USC, for example, I think is capable of making that leap. A Rutgers, I'm not sure if they are. And I think it's universally positive, the reviews on the job that Gridiron has done in both of his stints the last couple decades, in large part because you compare that to what anybody else has done with that program, and it's been far and away more successful than what they've done. At the end of the day, Rutgers is Rutgers, and you know, like I said, maybe they can make that jump. Indiana certainly is flirting with that right now, but it's very tough to fill a roster at Rutgers with the types of 4 or 5-star blue chip recruits that are going to allow you to compete at the top end of the Big Ten. I mean, Rutgers alone, like I think most people probably know the Rutgers in the state of New Jersey, but your casual college football fan probably couldn't even tell you what city Rutgers is located in. It's Piscataway, by the way. So that's the thing, is that this is kind of a program that infrastructurally is probably destined to be a mid-tier program at best. And that's okay. And so for our Canadian guys, I think it's great they have the opportunity to play these starring roles. And at the end of the day, it certainly isn't holding Antoine Raymond back, who is looking like a star in the making right now for them.
Speaking of stars in the making, Ty Benefield at Boise State. The Vancouver native was part of a Broncos team that demolished App State this past weekend. Now they go over into Notre Dame for a bit of a different challenge. Your thoughts on another breakout campaign so far for Benefield?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's clearly the leader of that defense, and I don't think that there's any real competition for that at this point in time. Led them in tackles again this past week and is leading them in tackles and tackles for a loss on the season. And that, as we noted on last week's show, is a testament to the versatility of Ty Benefield's skill set, right? He's also got a pick on the season already. He's also got a forced fumble on the season already. He does a little bit of everything back there, but you can also see when watching them that he is kind of the calming influence, the captain of that secondary as well for them. And so I think that grounding influence is also huge. So it's good to see that Boise State's season is kind of back on track after a tough opening weekend loss. And so it'll be quite the test against the Notre Dame team that was firing on all cylinders this past weekend at Arkansas. So I'll be interested to see how they stack up, because the one thing that we're still seeing with these Broncos is they don't necessarily have that game-breaking offensive talent that they had in Ashton Genty last year. So now the defense has to pick up the slack even more. It'll be interesting to see how they can hold up against a big step up in competition here.
As for the rest of the Canadians stateside, it's time for Alex McComb and Border Ballers.
Welcome to the first edition of Border Ballers, where this washed-up former college football player will take you through some of the Canadians down south on my radar each week. I'm in my cutoff camo today because we've got some guys in the trenches putting in work, like Wake Forest left tackle Melvin Siani. Coming off a controversial OT loss to Georgia Tech, this Hamilton native still hasn't given up a sack or a QB hit. He hasn't even allowed a hurry since week 1. He's got Virginia Tech next, a squad climbing back from 0-3, but has been applying pressure, so watch for Siani in protection on Saturday. Let's stay in the trenches with a beast from my hometown of Ottawa in Rene Conga. The Louisville D-tackle had a sack against Pitt, but what about these batted passes he's had? Must be taking tips from Wesley Bailey's sister, who played volleyball at York and Acadia. Cardinals meet Virginia next, who stormed the field against ranked Florida State this weekend, so it should be another good one. That's it for Border Ballers. I'll see you on Saturday.
Gord, there's the rest. Who is the best? Who is your NCAA Player of the Week?
It's got to be Antoine Raymond again, and I know that we've talked about him to death on the show already this season, but he is the breakout Canadian star of the college football season right now. He is currently tied for the national lead with 9 rushing touchdowns through 5 games. That is incredible for a guy that we weren't even sure was going to be a full-time starter this season. He's, after going well over 100 yards, I think 160 and change this past weekend, he's now up to 97 and change per game. So the rushing totals are starting to accumulate as well. And he just seems to keep getting better week after week, Jim. So he is a guy that is just continually blowing me away. And I'm finding it hard, frankly, to not have him picked for this award every single week of the season so far at this point.
When we come back, we will talk about rule changes and we'll be nice to each other. Stick around.
This portion of Gridiron Nation is brought to you by Crown Produce. Keep it fresh, Canada.
Welcome back with Gord, and he's joined by John Hodge from 3 Down Nation. We will jump to our rules discussion in just a second, but first, Gord, who is your U Sports Player of the Week?
I'm going to talk a little bit about Cal Wither, who's the latest in, I think, what's becoming a pretty vital pipeline of talent for U Sports is the bounce back from Division I, especially at the quarterback position. We've talked about Drew Viotto on the show a few times this year, and frankly, we've probably been a bit remiss to not talk about Cal Wither so far, who just casually put up another 350 and 3 tutties this past week. He has slid into the Laurier program and basically made it so that losing Taylor Elgersma didn't really matter that much to them. And Mike Fultz continues to mentor quarterback talent better than anybody in this country. And Wither's just the latest success story for that program at the pivot position.
So now let's get on to the rules piece. CFL Commissioner Stuart Johnson either energized or blindsided the Canadian football community last week with a reshaping of the sport 164 years in the making. Now, the changes are going to be rolled out in 2 phases in 2026 with some timing changes and making the Rouge a whole lot less relevant. Then in 2027 with the field changes. Just focusing on the CFL and the pro side first here, John. Is this the beginning of the end or the great leap forward, or is this just going to be Mr. In-Between?
I really like all the changes for 2026. I thought the commissioner could have done a better job giving details on the time change. I know a lot of anxiety was present among CFL fans about the last 3 minutes of the first and second halves, ensuring that the game remains, right? A game that can realistically have that no lead is safe title, right? And I'm sure Rules Committee will be tasked with that this offseason, ensuring that the 2027 changes are obviously larger for me. I am going to miss the 55-yard line. I am going to miss the missed field goal returns. That said, I do think that the potential for foreign games, right, for potential expansion, shrinking that field does make sense. But I will use this as an opportunity to give a PSA at the end of the 2026 Grey Cup in Calgary. I'll be making my way to midfield, and anybody who wants to join me to pour one out for the 55-yard line, feel free to come on down. We'll take a picture together. It'll be fun.
I mean, I think as ever in this country, like with this game, messaging probably wasn't ideal. And I agree with you, John, that I think they could have done a better job with that. But I also agree that I think they did a really good job of threading the needle here. And there was a lot of the predictable consternation from certain corners about how they're killing the spirit of the soul of the Canadian game. And I thought actually a friend of ours, Farhan Lalji, put it really well when he responded to it on TSN, where he said, when I think about the beauty of the Canadian game, when I think about watching a uniquely Canadian football game, I'm thinking about all the players in motion. I'm thinking about 3 downs. He's like, the things that have been changed here are not the things that I think about. And I agree with him completely on that. And he also rightfully pointed out all these rule tweaks are designed to kind of work together cohesively, right? The end zones get shrunk and the playing field gets shrunk because the uprights are being moved to the back of the end zone so we don't make kickers entirely obsolete. Those types of things. So the CFL just needs to do a little better job of controlling the narrative, I think. I think behind the scenes and in some other appearances, Stuart Johnson did a far better job of explaining things than he did in his initial press conference. And so we got reactions such as, oh, they've gotten rid of the Rouge. Well, no, they haven't. That's not true. And so if you control the narrative more effectively, then you can control that so that people aren't sitting there going, well, this is basically American football now. And of course, it doesn't really help that the most prominent player in the league, I would argue at this point, Nathan Rourke, was vehemently against it. I would suggest that that was kind of a put on the spot, spur of the moment reaction. And he probably would walk some of those comments back a little bit if you asked him again today. But those types of things, of course, made this a little bit more tumultuous and kind of obscured the fact that I think that this is a very positive change on the whole. I think it keeps the soul of the Canadian game. And at the end of the day, guys, evolve or die. Like, you cannot sit here and say that the CFL is going to be sustainable where it currently sits across the country right now. And if you think that, then you're pigeonholed somewhere in a prairie market where things aren't going well, because it's not across the country and it needs to evolve.
But Gord, there are three core aspects to this story, just as a story that gives it legs. It's like a fire triangle, actually. The fuel is the sport, the oxygen is the culture, and the heat is the business. Three very distinct things. Which one of those things do you want to take on in terms of the aspect of this story?
As much as I hate this, and I'm the first guy to complain about it, we live in a capitalist society. This is a capitalist enterprise. And the business has to be the first and foremost priority for the people that are running the league and making these decisions. That's who employs the commissioner, Stuart Johnson. That's who lives on the board of commissioners that makes these decisions. So while Nathan Rourke, for example, was right to criticize the fact that the players and the football ops people weren't consulted on the majority of these changes, at the end of the day, if teams are insolvent, then you don't have a league at all. And so while I would love to live in a world where that's not the case, that unfortunately is the case in the reality we have to live in, especially in a world in which the cross-border traffic between here and the United States is more complicated than ever.
When we come back, we'll take a look at the impact on the amateur side of the game.
This portion of Gridiron Nation is brought to you by NFL Canada.
High school football coaches nominate your players for the NFL Canada Way to Play Awards. Each week, winners earn a $3,000 equipment grant for their school program. Show us game footage that highlights safe, proper technique, and impactful play. Winners announced weekly on NFL Live and on NFL Canada's social channels. Learn more at nfl.com/CA Way to Play. Welcome back, everyone. Now let's take a look at these new rules and how they apply or don't apply to amateur football. What does amateur football in this country do, Gord, considering the cost that could be involved, and considering that in a lot of ways football is football and the current standard game may be better for development, especially the kicking game and in terms of crushing a playbook with the 20-yard end zone?
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that sentiment, and I also don't think that the how much is this going to cost to change the field thing really resonates with me either, because at the end of the day, like, we're shrinking the field. You don't have to create more space. You don't really have to do a lot to change the fields here. I mean, at the end of the day, you just have to move the goalpost by, 10 yards at either end zone, I think, if my math serves me correctly, right? So I don't really see what the big concern is about changing the field over. Now, I will say, and this feels uncomfortable just saying this, but U Sports, I thought, nailed their response to this in that they said, like, we're going to be in wait and see mode. We need to kind of figure out exactly what this is going to look like for our various institutions and then figure out what we need to do. Of course, they're in a tough position because 4 or 5 of the CFL markets share a venue with the U Sports team. And so they're going to have to probably go with whatever the CFL goes with, whether they like it or not. But I thought that it was wise of them to say, we need to absorb this information and make our own decisions. In terms of the ramifications on the amateur game, I don't know that it changes things a huge amount either way, though maybe with the kicking development, that's probably the most obvious example of maybe it changes things. But in terms of opening up the playbook, I thought Stuart Johnson pointed this out rightfully. Like, the number one impetus for these changes was actually to create more offensive opportunities in the end zone. And I think that eliminating one of those restrictions with the goalposts in the way makes it so that you can actually open up your offensive playbook more than you could before, even with the shorter depth of end zone.
Let's start with U Sports. I spoke with Wade Miller, the president and CEO of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, also a University of Manitoba Bison's alumnus. He said with the turf at Princess Auto Stadium, they paint the lines fresh for everything. They have soccer there, they have CFL there. He said if U Sports does not accommodate these new changes that the CFL makes, all it takes is the installation of 2 new anchors for where those uprights will need to be, and they can accommodate all 3 things: soccer, 100-yard CFL, and 110-yard U Sports. I believe the same is true in Calgary, where they've got new turf. Mosaic in Regina and McGill in Montreal, both, I believe, have stitched in lines. They certainly have stitched in logos in Regina, but both of those surfaces are now either close to or over 10 years old. So one would think by the time these changes come around in 2027, they could potentially fix those situations. As for the rest of amateur football, I mean, we have a ton of 100-yard fields in BC right now. That's a plus. They're already ahead of the game. For everywhere else across this country, I mean, look, I think the main hallmark of Canadian football is the 65-yard width. Playing on a 65-yard width versus a 53 and a third yard width is a completely different game. Playing on a 100-yard field versus a 110-yard field, to me, especially for, you're talking amateur football, like little kids, peewee, stuff like that, to me that is not a huge change. And a lot of those fields are painted on lines anyway that need to be done each year. So to me, the only obstacle for those fields is the uprights, and moving uprights. And I appreciate there are shoestring budgets, and those football groups operate largely on volunteer hard work, which we obviously appreciate from hardworking Canadians around this country. But moving uprights is not a massive, massive expense or undertaking if it's going to be done over a number of years. So I think Football Canada was smart. I think U Sports was smart. They're taking their time with this. And even if they decide to change things, I don't think the expense is going to be crazy. And if they don't adopt these changes, that's fine too. They never adopted the CFL's hash marks, and they're still doing fine. So to me, I don't see this as something to completely lose our minds about. The shorter field, the narrower field, absolutely. The downs, to me, is a sacred cow. You can't go to 4 downs. But the changes that have happened don't bother me too much. I don't see them as big obstacles.
Gord, 110 yards or 100 yards when it's 65 yards wide, does it make any difference?
Well, I think it does make a pretty significant difference in a few aspects of the game, most notably the kicking thing, as we alluded to earlier. But I would say logistically, again, on the business side of things, like, if you are a U Sports school that has a track around the outside of your field, you can now fit the field inside the track without having to cut out the corners of the end zone. So that's a big plus. And if you don't have a track around the field, let's not forget, you can now move the fans closer to the field as well and create more potential seating capacity in venues where you didn't have that before. So those are some nice little tertiary benefits of doing this as well, is that you create a more intimate environment. And that's one of the things that I think is just a universal improvement for the game. And so I do think, like, it's tough to wrap your head around making significant changes to your playing surface. But once you do that, I think that most of these schools will find, if they do, that that's going to be more positive than negative for them on the whole.
There is a leader in the U Sports community that told me on the day that this was rolled out, between permanently lined practice fields and game fields, it would cost them around $23 to $24 million to replace those fields right across the board. That would seem prohibitive, but John, that's something that might take 5, 6, 7, 8 years if they were to get up to speed. And if you're listening to Pierre Arsenault, he's also talking about, I was rather surprised about this, different teams playing on different sized fields. Is that even possible?
Well, I mean, the CFL has had different sized end zones in Toronto and Toronto and Montreal for the last many years, and nobody seemed to care. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing in the short term to have some 100-yard fields, some 110-yard fields. And I appreciate the cost is prohibitive, But at the same time, turf fields realistically should be replaced every 10 years. And so I don't think you need to have every single football field in this country, matching what the new CFL regulations will be as of 2027. Obviously, that's a ton of money for, again, what are often shoestring budgets. But can all the fields be the same by 2040? Maybe 2035, right? I think that's the better conversation to have, because it's not like installing a turf field with stitched in lines means that turf field is done forever and ever and amen. These fields have to be replaced to ensure the safety of athletes. And what we're learning more and more all the time is that grass is better than turf anyway. And obviously grass is a lot more versatile if you are just relying on painted lines rather than things that are stitched in. So I appreciate it in the short term. This has created some big headaches for youth sports, for amateur football. I get it. But if you take a longer term view, especially if we are going to go more grass than turf, and we are going to ensure that turf gets changed over at a reasonable time frame, I don't see this as a massive long-term problem.
John, thanks very much for coming on board. Coming up next, we'll have Gord's pick of the week. Stick around.
This portion of Gridiron Nation is brought to you by Crown Produce. Keep it fresh, Canada.
There it is, our CFC 50, the top 10 high school programs in the country for this week. By the way, if you're a high school football player born in 2009 to 2011, head on over to CanadaFootballChat.com to register now for the CFC Evaluation Camp Tour. Stop in one of 9 locations across Canada for your chance to play in the 2026 CFC Prospect Game on TSN. So, Gord, who do you have as the pick of the week?
Well, the Miami Hurricanes, coming off a bye, ranked 3rd in the country, take on one of their most bitter rivals this week as they travel to Tallahassee and play Florida State. And on the Seminoles side of things, what looked like a revitalization for them this season fell flat this past weekend as they were upset by Virginia. They need to recover quickly here to get where they want to be. On the Miami side, that's where our interest lies as Canadians, and we have to talk about Akeem Messidor, who going into this past weekend, with Miami being off, of course, prior to the games, was ranked 3rd in the country according to PFF in terms of pass rushing grade. In fact, there's a strong argument that the only pass rusher in the country who's been better than Messidor this year has been his running mate on the other side of the line, Ruben Bain Jr. And he's probably being overshadowed unfairly by Bain because he's been so fantastic. So Messidor is a guy who is blooming here as a 6-year senior. It's his swan song, and he wants to be that guy to help Miami finally get over the hump. They look like they're in great position to do so, but it's another big test this weekend against the Florida State offense that, prior to that upset, had been firing on all cylinders this season.
For everyone here on Gridiron Nation, this is Jim Mullin saying, let's get out to the game.